Waiting for this to connect so I can push the buttons. What is going on here? Oh, wrong one. Oh, here we go. I clicked the. Got two buttons, and one button will start the streaming, connect it to Facebook, and the other button will just record. But if I hit the streaming button, it automatically starts the recording process. And so I got to remember to click the correct one so I can click the other one, and we'll see whatever Facebook decides to do. And hopefully the microphone will cooperate. Was kind of looking back at some of the other videos, and I had that one where it was like 7 minutes I had to cut out because there was no sound because the microphone just didn't work. And then I guess it was Father's Day. There was about 2 minutes where the microphone wasn't working. I didn't cut that out, and it didn't interfere with the message, thankfully. But and I have that love-hate relationship with technology, and would love to go back to the old analog days, right? That's it. Yeah. Anyways, welcome in to Cruise Creek Baptist Church. Happy Sunday. Happy Lord's Day. Boy, it's getting hot out there. Staying hot. And then by the looks of everything, August is going to be even worse, and we could potentially be going into November with the wonderful heat. And growing up in Florida, like I did, you get used to it, but that was many years ago. So I'm not as used to it as I used to be. But regardless of the weather, I'll take every day above ground and every breath that God gives me and be thankful for it. So we're going to continue on in the book of Isaiah. We're going to look at chapter 39 today. And it really is, like I said, this is a good place to get a grasp on prophecy. But we are seeing here in the middle of Isaiah actual history. Some of it ties in with prophecy, especially what we're going to look at today, where it is future, very near future, not several hundred years. I mean, you see some of that prophecy from Isaiah regarding Christ and what's going to happen in the end times. But what we're going to see here with Babylon, because we know that Babylon is that's the final invasion. It's the final dispersal of the Israelites throughout the whole entire nation, not just the northern kingdom, but the southern kingdom finally succumbs. And it's just really interesting what we're going to see, especially when you look at Isaiah chapter 40, where we're going to give even more explanation, and we'll get into that next week. But again, it's a good place to get your start in prophecy and to see how God works. And so you can have that sober-minded approach towards what we need to know for what's going on today. And there's interesting things happening in the Middle East, and which started with Trump's Abraham Accords, and that's actually being put to the test right now in dealing with Iran. And but I'm not one to just jump out there and go, that's prophecy. I don't know. And I don't think that Scripture is clear on what's going on right now, other than the fact that there will come a point when all of God's enemies come together. And as I've heard one Messianic Jewish rabbi say years ago, all that's left in his eyes was for Israel to make a treaty with its enemies. Now, he didn't believe in the rapture. A number of Messianic Jews don't. Some do. It's actually probably about an even split, like it is for the rest of the Protestants, for us, Gentile Christians. I do believe in the rapture. And I think as I've said before, I believe that's what starts the tribulation. And I believe that's a solid teaching. And I also believe that that's when finally Israel does make that final peace treaty, is right there, because that will begin that first half of the tribulation where there is a false peace, right? But we get to see, we get an insight through Isaiah as to why these things happen. And it gives us an insight into the human mind to some extent, to our sinful nature and how we don't consistently trust God. And in some cases, we get, even if we do trust God, we end up becoming very arrogant after the fact. It's like you see one miracle and suddenly you're unstoppable. And that's not always the case. I mean, it would be great if it was. Certainly having our faith strengthened by seeing God at work is a good thing. But to go so far, like Hezekiah does here, to go so far that you end up kind of going full circle and now you're right back to where you were before you had enough faith to, because he gets healed from his sickness and he gets delivered from the Assyrian army. And as I mentioned with that, now all of a sudden everybody's going, whoa, hey, these guys, this little bitty place over here, Jerusalem, just defeated Assyria. We need to see what they got going on. We need to be their friends. So the pagan world and everybody else out there, and the Babylonians are looking at this because the Babylonians are starting to come up. And like I've said this before, I don't know that I could say that God put Trump in office. I'm thankful he's there. But I do know, and there's scriptural evidence, that God picks leaders and he picks nations to accomplish his will. So he raised up the Assyrians, and he said as much through Isaiah. He said, go out and tell the Assyrians this, tell Sennacherib, I'm the one that puts you in power. So don't sit there and think that you're, all that in a bag of potato chips just because you've defeated all these other enemies. You can't defeat me when I'm the one that gave you all the power to begin with. And so now we're going to see how Babylon enters the picture. And of course, we know that it's another 300 or so years from this occurrence to the time when Babylon actually takes the Israelites into captivity and disperses them, which does eventually begin brings you up to, that's Daniel, that's some of the other prophets right there that lead up to Malachi, where you have that 400 years of silence. And the Babylonian Empire itself doesn't exist anymore per se, but we tend to look at the stuff in Revelation and we look at the Babylon system that was established, and we know that the Roman Empire eventually is in charge of Jerusalem and Israel and that area in the Middle East, and they're the ones who invented the name Palestine. That was a slur against the Israelites and against God. So anybody who's talking about being pro-Palestine because they've always been there doesn't know what they're talking about. But we get a glimpse into Hezekiah's mind with this to see why it is we have so many problems in worshiping and following God. So it's an interesting chapter, short chapter. It ties in with 2 Kings 20 and 2 Chronicles. Let me see, I have this written down somewhere. 32, yeah, 2 Chronicles 32, towards the end of that chapter, or somewhere in the middle, around verse 31. But as I said, this is actual history. This is real time when Isaiah is recording this. And it's just, like I said, it's an interesting look into our sinful psyche, especially with our leadership. So Isaiah chapter 39, the Envoys from Babylon. starting off verse 1. At that time, and you might, if you have a King James or some of the older versions, you might see Marduk as the name. I have Merodach Baladan, the son of Baladan, king of Babylon, sent envoys with letters and a present to Hezekiah, for he heard that he had been sick and had recovered. And Hezekiah welcomed them gladly, and he showed them his treasure house, the silver, the gold, the spices, the precious oil, his whole army, all that was found in his storehouses. There was nothing in his house or in all his realm that Hezekiah did not show them. Then Isaiah the prophet came to King Hezekiah and said to him, "What did these men say? And from where did they come to you?" Hezekiah said, "They have come to me from a far country, from Babylon." He said, "What have they seen in your house?" Hezekiah answered, "They have seen all that is in my house. There is nothing in my storehouses that I did not show them." Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, "Hear the word of the Lord of hosts. Behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house and that which your fathers have stored up till this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord, and some of your own sons who will come from you, whom you will father, shall be taken away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon." Then said Hezekiah to Isaiah, the word of the Lord that you have spoken is good, for he thought, there will be peace and security in my days. What a strange thought. To find out that you're going to be taken off into captivity, but as long as there's peace, that's okay. What a strange thought. Dear Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this day, dear Lord, this opportunity to come into your presence. We just thank you for the many blessings that we did not deserve, dear Lord, and we just ask that you would give us forgiveness where we have failed you, dear Lord, that we are able to make ourselves better representatives for your kingdom, dear Lord, that we are better disciples, and that we are able to take something from this warning, from this true story, dear Lord, of prideful arrogance, that we would be able to warn others and ourselves, dear Lord, just again be better disciples in your kingdom. And we ask for all this in Jesus' precious name. So, somebody shows up on your door, you don't know them from nothing. And, back then they didn't just travel with one or two people. It wasn't like, hey, let's get on a plane and go visit this foreign country. You're talking about you're talking about soldiers showing up, you're talking about, which is security. They're not necessarily there to attack. Again, they brought gifts for Hezekiah. They're not there to attack him, but you set up your own security so as you travel, you're safe. And then you don't have just one representative. There's a whole bunch. There's one leader. But, for them to show up, bringing a gift, having heard that Hezekiah had been healed. Now, is this right at or right before or right after the defeat of the Assyrian army? I get the feeling that it was just like right after that. They had heard that he was sick and had been healed, which is an interesting thing for that word to be spread out into the surrounding nations. Although when a miracle happens, what do people do? They talk about it. This guy's got a God that actually does stuff. Maybe we need to go see what he's got going on. Let's go, So people are curious about that kind of thing. But again, Babylon shows up. They're an up-and-coming power. As I said, God will raise up whomever he sees fit to accomplish his will. And we know that he uses Babylon to judge Israel and to discipline them. And that does lead to their dispersion. But this is that key point where you find that you kind of get a glimpse into, you get that foreshadowing, you get that glimpse into the future. And we find out that this is not going to go well for them. Well, why? Because Hezekiah, in for whatever reason, is arrogant enough. And we know that in his lifetime, there was peace. And once Assyria was defeated, for the rest of Hezekiah's reign, he got that extra 15 years. And for the rest of his time, nobody messed with them. Why? Because they defeated Assyria. Well, God did. He didn't even use the Israelite army. He used an angel, but they still got credit for it, right? Because that's their God, the one true God that everybody goes, man, wow, their God actually does something. Ours just sits on the shelf. It's a statue in a room. You hope God's not knocking them over, right? But this is somewhere around 700 BC. And so this could be a few years later. Again, 2 Kings 20, 2 Chronicles 32 is where you can find this to dig in more into. And I'll share it on Facebook. I've got a Sunday school lesson specifically about King Hezekiah, and I talk about this. But it's, we have a quote from Benjamin Franklin. Interestingly enough, in the early days in the foundation of our nation, and he says, those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. And that is like the first thing that came to mind. First time I ever read this in the Bible, and the first time I ever got into Hezekiah and got into Kings and Chronicles, and I read this, and I'm thinking to myself, because his statement at the end, as long as there's peace, it's okay. And we're seeing that in our nation right now. There's so many weird things going on. Our government's doing so many strange things, and you have all these companies coming up. If you've seen these little cameras on poles with the little solar panels on them, as you're driving around the road, they're called flock cameras, F-O-O-C-K. They're potentially violating our constitutional rights because it's constant surveillance. But from the standpoint of law enforcement, where they can track a car, they can catch a criminal, they can, but at the same time, when you get into studying those cameras and you actually listen to the guy who invented the whole thing, they're using AI, and they know all the dents on your car. So even if you find a way to shield your license plate, they can still identify your car based on the dents you have. It's wow. But we're giving up our liberty, so to speak. We're giving up our freedom for that safety. And that's a whole different discussion of the time. But it's kind of the same mindset, though. It really, this arrogance of, as long as there's peace, it's okay. And so here's Hezekiah showing everything in the household to a complete stranger. And that blows my mind. I mean, if you're a complete stranger, you're not coming in my house. Certainly not right away. Even if you do, I'm not showing you where I keep the guns. I got family don't know where I keep my guns. But it's, a complete stranger shows up bearing gifts and says, here you go. I'm your friend. Again, it's that your God just defeated, you and your God just defeated the biggest, baddest, toughest guy on the schoolyard. I want to be your friend. And we know later on that Babylon is overall challenging Assyria. That's the whole reason behind them wanting to have anything to do with Israel and with Judah is because they're going to challenge Assyria. And of course, we know they will be successful because God raises them up as an entity that will be able to chastise Israel for their sins. And part of that is this arrogance. And there's no escaping the fact that God took care of the Assyrians for Hezekiah and Judah. And, it says as much. Hezekiah knows this, but he's going to sit there and come at these Babylonian folks with prideful arrogance that somehow maybe, and it doesn't say this, so I'm just projecting this, but it's like, oh, I command God, or I command the armies of God, or I can get an angel come down and do what I want done. Because maybe just maybe it's in the will of God. It's there's some that arrogance is in there, and it's wrong thinking. God wanted his will to be done. God had spent 36 chapters in Isaiah promising Hezekiah, I'm going to take care of you. You don't need to worry about it. And of course, God keeps his promises. So there's no reason why Hezekiah should have been so arrogant, should not have been so prideful. And, God granted him another 15 years of life. How selfish is that? I get to live another 15 years, but then my children after me, well, yeah, I ain't worried about them folks. Something we see today. What does our government do? They're spending trillions of dollars into our future so that my grandchildren are already in debt, $100,000 apiece, as citizens of America. So it's when you focus on yourself and you don't really worry about the future. And I know we're admonished at some certain parts of the Bible that we don't need to worry about the future because God's already there. God's already got things taken care of, but it doesn't mean that you go and do dumb things. It doesn't mean that, hey, I've got my salvation. I'm going to heaven. God's got me. I'm just going to walk in front of a car. I'm going to walk in front of a bullet. Just because, God's going to save me. People that would say, well, we don't need any security in our churches because we're here and God's going to take care of us. And then you see a church shooting. Synagogue got shot up. A church got shot up. Or they got burned down. Or and this happened during the Obama administration. The Chinese government bulldozed a church with over 200 people in it during their Sunday morning service. Chinese Christians in China if God is in the business of just absolutely protecting you, why did those things happen, right? Now, and that's not to say we can't trust and rely on God. There's plenty of situations where God has sent angels and stopped things from happening, but he doesn't always do that. And the goal is not to focus so much of what's here on earth. And I've said this before, it's not for all of us to be martyrs and die, because then who's left to spread the gospel? So, it's not everybody's meant to go out into a very violent place to spread the gospel. You have to really, truly be called by God, and then he really, truly will pave the way, so to speak, for you to be able to do those things. But we're not all called to that. And we're certainly not all called to take up arms and fight everybody. You can defend yourself all day long. If somebody came up in here and started shooting people and we shot back, there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. That's completely and totally acceptable by not just society, secular standards, it's acceptable by biblical standards. We're not to be doormats for anybody. But to just assume that God is just going to, I know there's a lot of Christians right now that have had their minds corrected by God. COVID did it. As I said, at one deacon talking about how as long as you do what God says and you live your life as godly as possible, you're never going to get sick. And then he got COVID. Interestingly enough, his wife would say, well, there's no reason to have guns in this church. Not in God's house. We're not going to have guns in God's house. And the three of us went to a security training seminar a couple of years ago with the State Board of Missions. So, it's, you look around you and you see the reality of things around you. And so Hezekiah's not really focusing on the reality of things. He's just kind of riding that high from our enemies just got defeated. I'm healed. I've got another 15 years of life. It's all good right now. But what's it going to be down the road? And again, when an enemy shows up and you don't know, when a stranger shows up at your door bearing gifts, and then you show them everything you've got. And if it's just, there's things that are amazing, and I'm pretty sure I've got this right, with when the Babylonians take over Jerusalem, there was no bloodshed. They just walked right in. They knew where everything was. They waited until they were partying and having a good old time. They walked in, they killed a few people, maybe, but I mean, all in all, they walked in and took charge. And next thing you know, there's no more Jerusalem. It's under Babylonian control. But that's okay as long as there's peace, right? Somebody come in and take your stuff as long as they do it peacefully. No. And that's we see all kinds of instances when you look at Jacob and Esau, right? And I saw somebody try to sit there and say, well, Esau really was the good guy. He wasn't so bad. Jacob was the one that caused all the problems. Jacob was the one that was fearing for his life. And so when they finally reunited, his brother Esau was the one who forgiven him and all this, that, and the other. But let's go back to the beginning of that. What created that whole situation in the first place? And how was it that Esau, being the firstborn, is not the one that inherited the promise? Because he sold his birthright for a pot of stew. He was hungry, and he sold his birthright to feed his stomach. And there was no fighting for it. There was no, in that moment, he basically said, I ain't worried about you, God. I'm just worried about my stomach. I'm worried about me in this moment right now. And that's how we see that Jacob is the one. Because despite his issues, and Jacob means trickster, and despite all the weird stuff going on there, and there's all those other reasons, and Abraham having all his issues, and everybody having different mothers and all that kind of stuff, and it happened with Jacob too. A lot of that stuff played into that, but one thing Jacob never did was sell out God for his stomach, for his own greed, for his own personal gain. And it might seem like a stretch when you're talking about a pot of stew, but if you're willing to give up your future for the temporary present, what does that really say about you? And Hezekiah is in that same place. Now we have this promise of the bloodline of David, and there will always be somebody from the house of David sitting on the throne. We have that promise. But does that mean that you get to, be so prideful and arrogant that you just assume our salvation is a free gift of God, and we are to work out our salvation with fear and trembling, but it's not something you have to fight for, but it's not something to take so much liberty that you are running around, it's not a get out of jail free card and you can just sin however you want to. We get accused of that all the time by Jews and by non-Christians, and by the Christians out there that think that you can lose your salvation because it's not works-based, it's grace-based. But that still doesn't give us the right, and Paul warns us of that. Just because you got freedom, just because you can, doesn't mean you should. And we don't need to abuse the freedom we have in the Lord. We don't need to abuse the freedom we have and the liberty we have. They did a research project many, many years ago, and they took a park, built a little playground right in the middle of this park, and brought all the kids out there, and the kids stayed right there around the monkey bars and the jungle gym and the swing set and all that. They stayed right there in the middle. And then they built a fence around it. When they built that fence, suddenly the kids felt the safety and the freedom to go out and explore the whole entire piece of property. That whole entire park suddenly became a safe place, right? And that's the way it is with God. When we're outside of God and outside of his will and outside of his salvation, we see this today with all the ungodly folks running around screaming weird stuff, but they tend to mass up in a group. And they huddle and they get together, and it's this weird group thing because they don't have that people love to get our hedge of protection from the Lord, right? Something we should always be praying for. And they don't have that. And so they don't know they don't know where they're going when they die. They don't know that there is anything there, it's this weird, they don't have that blessed assurance, right? So when you become saved, that fence, that hedge of protection comes up around you. You know where you're going when you die. And you know who's in control. You know who's going to defeat your enemies, who's going to defeat the armies. You know these things. And you can study the Bible and it registers. But it doesn't mean that you get to go out and act like hell thinking you're going to heaven. It doesn't mean you get to abuse people. It doesn't mean you get to hurt people. It doesn't mean that you get to just thumb your nose at the government for no reason. That's a tough thing for us here in America, considering that our nation, while founded on Judeo-Christian principles, also has that piece of rebellion tied to it because we had to rebel against ungodly forces. And that's when you have that common enemy, it's much easier for us to coalesce and come together as one strong unit. As I've said, half of us, and we got midterms coming up here in a few months, half of professing evangelical Christians don't vote. Where would our nation be if we could get, and like I broke it down the last time I said this, at least 2/3 of the populace is eligible to vote, 18 and older. If we apply that same kind of numbers to evangelical Christians here in America, 2/3 of them ought to be able to vote, approximately. And I don't know what that is, because 65% of statistics are made up on the spot, 90% of the time they're correct, right? But or as someone once famously said, 60% of the time it's right every time. But anyways, if we apply that, then that's still a significant number. If 30% of our population, roughly, because it goes up and down, 30% claim to be Christians. That's not the same thing as how many people actually go to church and that sort of stuff, but you have at least 30% of our population claims to be Christian. And so if that's the case, half of those don't vote. You have 50% of the population that doesn't vote. If we can get that other 15% to vote, and if, like I said, 2/3 of that, so if we can get at least 10% of the population in America that claims to be a Christian to vote, you don't have a Bill Clinton, you don't have Barack Obama, you don't have Joe Biden, which eliminates the need for Donald Trump. Again, thankfully he's there. Please don't get me wrong on that. I have never been a never Trumper. I've never been an anti-Trump guy. Because I see the pragmatic position of there's nobody else. We don't have Trump, Hillary Clinton becomes president. Woman's evil. So, anyways, if we're willing to sacrifice our safety and our security for our safety, our liberty for our safety, then we're going to end up with none of it. That was a very wise thing that Franklin said all those years ago. And of course, we kind of update it and more modern to say that if we're willing to give up our security for our safety, then we're not going to have either one. But it's here's Hezekiah kind of riding that wave. He's got healed. The Assyrian army's defeated. He's right. He's on top of the world. Everything's all good. He's got another 15 years of life. Everything is hunky-dory. Everything's great. So let's just show everybody what we got. I mean, I spent 7.5 years in the Navy. And when people came to tour our ship, and you do that kind of a PR thing, we pulled into like Seattle for Fleet Week, or San Francisco for Fleet Week, and they do it up and down the East Coast as well, Virginia and Norfolk and all those places. And there's sensitive parts of the ship you don't show them. You don't know who's coming aboard. You don't know if they're illegal aliens. You don't know if they're foreign nationals from Russia, from China, whatever. You might give them a tour of the ship, but you're not showing them the missile silos. You're not showing them where all the 5-inch ammunition is stored. And you're not divulging, how many people are on board the ship. You're not talking, there's just stuff you just don't talk about. In order to have, what they say in World War II and all those posters, loose lips sink ships. And the funny thing with that is, in Bahrain, I went over and toured a British vessel, little like a frigate, somewhere between a frigate and a destroyer, and they actually showed me the missile silo. They had this thing on the front, we called them one-armed bandits, and they're super fast, and you can launch a missile in no time at all. It's a really neat system. But they actually showed me the room where the operator sits there and controls it, and it's this little, you got this little window, and I'm looking right at a live missile. This was a Canadian ship. So, now we're allies. And I'm on that pier, and I have my military ID, so I know for a fact that I'm in the U.S. Navy, so it's not like I'm just some weirdo off the street wanting to look at stuff. But I was curious about what other navies had and what other ships were like. And, so here I am, though. I'm not a Canadian, but I am an ally, because, that might be debatable at this stage of the game with Canada, but we're finally starting to realize that everybody loves the freedom of all these apps on our phones, and they've just released confirmation that China stole over 220 million identities, and they used TikTok to do it. They created several 100 million fake IDs in order for Chinese nationals to come and vote in America. Really messed up system. But anyways, so it's, if they're your ally, sharing some of that sense. Now, they didn't tell me missile speeds, and they didn't give me codes, and they didn't do all that kind of stuff, but they showed me a part of the ship that you would never see on an American vessel. That's sensitive and all that sort of stuff. So operational security would prevent anybody, ally or otherwise, especially one that didn't have a clearance for that. But it's kind of interesting, because I'm reading this, and I had a similar situation like that. But you don't go bragging about how many guns you got in your house. You don't go bragging about where you've got, if you've got gold. If you're one of those types and you want to have it and hoard it, you don't tell anybody you got it. You definitely don't tell them where the safe is. And you don't tell them where to find the map to find the coffee can buried in the backyard, right? But, and on that being said, don't hide anything under your mattress. That's the first place they look. But here's Hezekiah, prideful and arrogant over what God has done. And he reveals everything to Babylon. And you would think at this stage of the game, you would think that he should be looking at everybody as your enemy. Israel has no friends. Everybody hates them. To this day. And our government, unfortunately, is being overrun by anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, anti-Zionist people, which is not a rubber stamp for them to do what they want to do. I mean, you got the mayor of New York right now threatening to arrest the prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, of Israel, because the International Criminal Court claims that he's committed crimes. And the mayor of New York City, who has zero authority, is threatening to arrest the man when he comes to New York to go to the UN. I mean, what in the world? And people elected that man to have free stuff. And you look at the state of New York City right now. They gave up their liberty and their safety for free stuff. And they have none of it now. They didn't get their free bus rides. And the violence is just ridiculous in New York City. So they lost their safety and their security, their liberty. I mean, when it's, I got a cousin, distant cousin up around, it's from Jersey, and you have Atlantic City and all that. And of course, there's a lot of casinos and junk, so you have issues there. But it's supposed to be this, Atlantic City is supposed to be this tourist place, and people are supposed to be able to come there and there's all these motorcycle quad gangs riding around. It's not safe. They attack everybody. It's just, people, there's drug deals going on right outside of a resort casino that's supposed to be a place for you to go and safely enjoy yourself, right? As I said, that's debatable and whatnot just because of the gambling. But when they promise you free stuff, what happens? You end up losing more than you gain. So all of this should be cautionary tale. All of this should tell us that we have to be vigilant. We have to be the watchman on the wall, as they had in Nehemiah's days when they were rebuilding Jerusalem. We have to be those watchmen. We have to be looking out. We have to be reading and studying our Bibles to see what God has done and hasn't done and won't do, but he will do, what he's promised to do. And then we've got to go out and look at society. We got to get outside the four walls of this church, and we've got to look at society and say, don't let that camel get his nose under the tent. Don't vote for that politician, regardless of whether they got an R or a D, but definitely a D. Don't vote for that guy because he's secretly a Muslim. Not a secret anymore. But, we have to be able to recognize the evil in the world through the eyes of God. And I believe it was Jim Caviezel was talking about in his acting, if you took on a role of playing a bad guy, that you go to God himself. And there's another actor said something very similar. But you don't go to the enemy. You don't go to the devil and say, how am I going to portray you? You go to God and say, God, help me to, through you, portray what evil looks like. That way it doesn't consume you. Because we've seen other actors who've been consumed by the evil they've portrayed. And there's a lot of other weird stuff in Hollywood. It's a whole nother message. But the point is we have to go to God first, go through God first, and not be so arrogant as to think I can handle whatever because God's just going to do what I say when I say to do it. He's not a cosmic piggy bank. He's not a cosmic slot machine that, I'm going to hit jackpot. I'm going to get all 3 cherries across every time I pull that God arm. Doesn't work like that. It's 20 years of ministry, and I'm a poor fat guy living in the woods. And I got to work 60 hours a week. And I'm not complaining. I'm just saying it's not always health and wealth that you get when you follow the Lord. The blessing, again, is in heaven in the future, not necessarily right now. Although it can happen right now. It just depends on his will and how he decides to do things. But I still have to get up and go to work. And I still have to pray without ceasing, as Paul says. And I still have to focus on God. And I still have to read my Bible. And I still have to study. And I still have to go out and spread the gospel, as Jesus tells us there in in Matthew, go forth and make disciples of all nations. Still have to go out and do these things. But I do them because I love God and I'm thankful. And it's the only way I can do anything close to repaying, and it doesn't even come close to repaying Christ's death upon that cross that bought me my freedom. That most of us are just so willingly eager to give up simply for peace. Hezekiah is willing to sacrifice his children. And not every eunuch is castrated in the Bible necessarily, but a great many of them are. And he's going to sacrifice his children, probably his grandchildren, whoever else down the line are going to be taken as eunuchs, as servants into the Babylonian kingdom. That's just not a good place to be. So as long as there's peace, it's okay. No. Nowhere in the Bible, other than the other side of heaven, nowhere in the Bible does it say we're going to have peace. Right at the end of the mess, there it goes. I got the microphone back. Right there at the end. It hung in this whole entire time. I guess that means it's time to shut this down, huh? If we give up our liberty for security, we will have neither. And that's exactly what Hezekiah did. He gave up Israel's safety and security for peace. And the Israelites didn't have any peace. Now, would it have happened anyways? Probably. Even if he'd have kept the Babylonians at bay and said, hey, here's the foyer. That's about as far as you're going. Thank you for the gift. Here's a meal right here in the foyer. That's as far as you're going. Israel still became a prideful nation, still had their issues, and still had to be dealt with by God. And so we know that certain things have to happen, but we know that it's going to get worse before it ever gets better, but it doesn't mean you not fight for it. We know there's a certain amount of people that are going to hell. We just know that because the Bible says not everybody who cries, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, and not everybody who's presented Jesus in salvation is going to accept it. How many times did we see that in the New Testament? How many times was he rejected by the Pharisees? Nicodemus walked away from him. So we know for a fact there are people who are going to reject God. But does that mean we don't fight for them? Does that mean we don't pray for them? Does that mean we don't share the gospel with them? We're absolutely, Ms. Joy, we're supposed to be out there because we don't know. I don't know who gets to go to heaven and who doesn't. Outside of people that choose Christ, I don't know who's going to do it and who's going to reject him. But that doesn't mean that I'm not supposed to say something. Hezekiah doesn't know, and now Isaiah comes and tells him, hey, there's going to come a time when Babylon's just going to walk in and take everything. So there you are. And because of your prideful arrogance, this is what's going to happen. And it's going to be that easy. Just because you wanted some peace. And we see that peaceful times make for weak men. And weak men make for hard times. Doesn't have to be like that. But if we put our faith and our trust in God and we stay vigilant, we get upon that wall and we call out the enemy when we find it, we're going to be blessed by God.